What do proposal managers need to know in order to understand solicitations and build a winning, compliant proposal to win new business with the DoD? Erin Butt, Director of Proposals and Marketing at Odyssey Systems Consulting Group, will share strategies for contractors in the RFP process in this next session. Erin manages all bid and proposal activities across the Odyssey enterprise, has supported proposals for over 15 years, and has been in the defense industry for over 30 years. Having worked with large, small, and 8A companies, a range of strategies have proven successful over the course of Erin's career. From her experience, Erin will share best practices as well as how to work with other departments like IT and legal to build a winning proposal. Thank you for being here with us today, Erin.
Erin, thank you so much for joining us. One of the things that I think is just wonderful about you being here today is that our audience, as you know, is many of them are focused on cybersecurity, and they're in various roles. Could be CIO, Chief Information Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, FSO, Facility Security Officer. But you sit in the contract seat, and I just thought, what a wonderful opportunity to talk to somebody with all your experience in DoD contracting and going through the proposal process, because ultimately, what I think those in the CIO, CISO, FSO seat need to understand is where these requirements actually show up when their companies are trying to do business with the Department of Defense. So I'd love to start with just asking you, where would I find the DFARS NIST requirements in a contract that I was planning to bid on? And then how do you ensure that the requirements are addressed in the proposals?
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's good to be here. Back when I first started, this would be a very easy question because DoD solicitations or requests for proposals were all structured the same. There were sections A through M, and you could very easily go to the clauses section. You could go to the reps and certs section. Today, organizations and agencies within the Department of Defense all think they are different, so they structure their solicitations differently. We now have task order proposals, we have fair opportunity proposals, we have solicitations. So you really have to read the entire document to find those requirements. We are definitely seeing more IT and cyber related requirements, especially with CMMC and cyber restrictions. There still should be a clauses section, and there still should be, in the instructions, it should tell you if you need any certifications.
Now, that's great advice, because I think one of the challenges we hear all the time from the folks in the trenches and cybersecurity delivering those capabilities on a day-to-day basis is, I'm not sure if I have this clause, and I think your advice of you have to read the entirety of the contract because it could be in many different places depending on the agency is good advice. And then we often hear, and I'd love to get your perspective on this, we have the clause in our contract, but I don't think we actually have any CUI, any controlled unclassified information. So if someone's in that situation, they clearly have the clause in their contract, but they don't believe they have CUI, what steps could they take to kind of verify and address that?
So any information or data that is CUI will be labeled. We've seen over, I would say, the past 12 to 18 months, CUI is coming up more and more. Actually, any organization or agency can label data CUI. I've come across information that, for example, DCMA can label a company's information CUI without the company even knowing it. So you could own CUI information, and as soon as you start transmitting it, as soon as you put it on your network, you now have CUI information. So it is definitely labeled, or it should be labeled. You need to go through, you should do a scrub and make sure that, number one, access is controlled and that it's labeled properly.
And if it's not labeled, Erin, is your perspective like if the clause is clearly in the contract, but I can't find any CUI labeled, anything labeled that way, is your advice to say, well, the government or somebody, whoever you're contracting with, thinks you have CUI and you've taken the contract, so you've kind of attested to the fact that you've got an environment that can hold CUI. So if there isn't clearly marked CUI and you have the clause in your contract, do you still have the requirement?
You still have the requirement. You may not have CUI. It is becoming a standard clause. So the government puts it in there to cover themselves. So you may not have any, and you just need to be aware moving forward. As I said, it's becoming more and more prevalent. So I would keep an eye out when you get a solicitation. Parts of a solicitation may be labeled CUI. That's usually easy to pick up on because there's usually a requirement for encryption. If you download a solicitation, they'll very clearly say, hey, there are parts that are CUI. You need to reach out to the government contracting officer and set up an encrypted email so that we can send you this information. Once you receive it from the government, so regardless of whether it's your CUI or theirs, you need to make sure it is controlled. So we would limit access and that it's labeled properly, and all of the stakeholders that have access know that it's limited. So you don't want them downloading it to their desktop and sending it in a non-encrypted email.
That's a great point in terms of getting ready for CUI and then notifying various stakeholders that how they have to handle CUI, and obviously the training requirements around handling, processing, storing CUI are outlined within NIST 800-171. But how do you deal with when you're bidding a proposal and you have these requirements? I know in your case, you've been thinking about and getting ready and are ready for CMMC and have been for a long time. But for a company who's not kind of done all that work leading up to this point, what's your advice for the kind of proposal, the bid teams who see those requirements to go back and make sure their FSO, CIO, CISO knows that this is coming and can start to set up the environment for the acceptance of CUI if they're to win that contract? How do you recommend a company handle that?
Requirements today are so intermingled that corporate departments can't work in silos. I have to work hand in hand with my IT department. I work hand in hand with the security department and our FSO. We have regular reviews where we look at requirements and say, hey, this is coming out. We'll sit down as a group and say, what are the impacts? We do kind of a risk review. I am not an IT expert, so I regularly meet with my director of IT, and we talk about, okay, what can the network handle? What are the requirements? For example, CMMC is requiring FedRAMP compliance for any software that we use. So we sit down and figure out what we need to do and how we best implement it, but it cannot be done in a silo. It needs to be done, and it needs to be spearheaded and backed by corporate.
I think that's amazing advice, Erin, because, in my experience is that it really does start by the leadership team and driving those requirements and that kind of culturally driving that down. And you make the point, I think, that it's really a team sport, and contracts may be kind of at the tip of the spear in terms of seeing the requirement, but they kind of need to bring in the IT, FSO, and the other stakeholders so that it can be a team approach. Because security certainly can't do this alone. You started off and you talked about how these requirements are intermingled, and now depending on the agency and what part of the government you're dealing with, everyone may have a different way of putting these requirements in a proposal or request for proposal. So where formerly it was kind of just go to section L&M, you could see your requirements. With the requirements spread out throughout the kind of contract or the request for proposal, how do you ensure that you're aligned with and meeting all of the compliance requirements during the proposal development process?
As soon as we get a request for proposal, solicitation, task order proposal, the first thing we do is build a compliance matrix. and go through and look at all of the required clauses, the instructions, the requirements, and then we assign a point of contact. Whether that's a contracts manager going through and looking at all of the clauses, and the Department of Defense has gotten very clever. They have standard clauses. There'll be 2 pages of, hey, you need to comply with this, you need to comply with that, but they don't list them. So you either have to have someone in the organization that's knowledgeable about what that current clause is, or you need to have someone go look every clause up and make sure that you're complying with it. So building a compliance matrix right away and divvying up those responsibilities, because it can be a lot. And it's again, it's not one department. There's, Buy American Act. There's sex trafficking clauses now. I mean, there's just a whole slew of them that are standard. I would say a typical solicitation has at least 2 pages of clauses you have to comply with.
Wow, that's a tremendous lift for a lot of contractors. And so would you say that if I was maybe if I wanted to be proactive versus kind of hoping and waiting that kind of a busy bid team is going to reach out to me as the FSO, CIO, CISO, security administrator, whoever's kind of responsible for IT and security, would a proactive approach, if I went to my contracts person, my bid team and said, let me see the compliance matrix for everything you're bidding this quarter, this year, that's a language they'd speak and they'd know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. And you could even take that one step further. If there wasn't a solicitation that you were actively working on, so you didn't have a compliance matrix, most contracts departments are aware of what the current FAR requirements are and what's sort of hot on the minds of DoD, like CMMC. I mean, everyone's looking at CMMC now. How do I get compliant? What are the requirements? So most contract managers get some kind of notification or know when there's a changing requirement or a new clause and where to find those requirements and how to comply.
That's great too, because I think giving the audience today, I think a way to be proactive and not just wait and hope someone taps them on the shoulder is pretty meaningful, particularly with, as you kind of alluded to, CMMC really being at our doorstep. I think that's great. And it elevates, frankly, the function of security and IT. I mean, everybody understands the importance of kind of contracts, winning bids and proposals. And so a partnership between IT and security, or the FSO and the contracts organization and the bid and proposal part of the company, I think could really elevate the function. And so I think that's great advice. When it comes to cost, one of the things that naturally we've heard a lot of pushback from small contractors, all the industry lobby groups around the cost of CMMC. And one of the things that I think is interesting is the government has said it's really foundational, and that cybersecurity is now a foundational to procurement within the Department of Defense. And so how do you think about accounting for cost associated with cybersecurity requirements when bidding, and how do you integrate those costs into your proposals? Is it a separate kind of line item that says CMMC, or what's that look like?
In today's environment, it is just a cost of doing business. You look at all of these cyber threats out there. Aside from the CMMC requirements, organizations are dealing internally with their own, how do we protect our network? How do we protect ourselves from being hacked? So I think it's just a cost of doing business. What we've found is once you put in that initial time, and it is, again, it's when you're looking across the entire organization, when you're looking at multiple departments, it is a time commitment. That is a resource. But once you have that infrastructure and you have those processes and policies, I actually think it could be a money saver. But there's no line item, there's no budget. It is just embedded in the cost of doing business in today's environment.
So would that show up really kind of in the overhead rates typically then when you're bidding a new contract?
Overhead or G&A, depending on how the accounting system works, yes. In our organization, we really rely on the IT department when you're talking about if there's required software or additional processes. So they kind of account for the amount of resources needed, but yeah, it's 100% embedded in our overhead or G&A rates.
It's a great, another great takeaway for the audience today that's pretty meaningful is that I think a tool for those FSOs, CIOs, CISOs to go to their partners in contracts or the bid and proposal team and say, hey, how are you accounting for CMMC in your overhead or G&A rates when you're bidding? And that can at least, at a minimum, generate a conversation. And, the answer could be, we aren't. How are you? What is the cost? How are you measuring that over in IT? And at least spark a conversation. So I think that's great information for the audience today. I think you already answered one of the next questions, but I just really want to kind of emphasize this point around the process used. You mentioned a compliance matrix because CMMC feels new to a lot of people, even though the core requirements have been around for almost 10 years. It's in more than 1 million contracts today, DFARS Clause 7012. But in the IT and security community, it's often talked about as this new thing that's changing government and government procurement. But I think what I heard you say is that it's just another requirement and we deal with it in the compliance matrix and that's really kind of just become part of the standard way that we bid contracts. Did I summarize that right?
Yeah, that's really a two-part question, I think. So when you're dealing with a standalone opportunity, a standalone solicitation, they are starting to embed cyber requirements, whether it's in the form of CUI or different restrictions. CMMC is going to be required of all DoD contracts, I believe by the end of 2025. We have been working, my organization has been working for about 6 or 7 months looking at what we need to do or change to make sure that we are compliant. So this isn't you need to make sure you don't buy IT equipment from China. Check the box. We have had to look at our infrastructure. We have had to make sure that we have CUI processes in place. We have had to make sure that we have ways to restrict permissions when we're storing CUI data on our network. And in one instance, we have actually had to change our software. Now, it resulted in a cost savings for us, but we had been using a software to store some proposal data, and they are not, the software company is not FedRAMP compliant. So as long as we're using that software, we are not CMMC compliant. So luckily we got ahead of it. We were able to develop an internal solution. So when the requirement does come, we will be compliant.
I'm curious because it sounds like that was a 6 to 7 month journey. It involved changing out some enterprise software to meet compliance. So sounds like there's a good deal of planning and in getting ready for CMMC. This isn't just a switch you can flip.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because the company behind the software provides a lot of software to DoD customers, and they were not even aware that the FedRAMP compliance requirement was required for CMMC. So I'm not even sure what they're going to do. So yeah, it's not a check the box. It's not let me, put in an additional firewall and we're compliant. You really have to look across the enterprise and make sure that you have the right processes and tools in place.
That's a great set of kind of points for our audience to keep in front of mind and in consideration, because as we see CMMC finalized really here, right at the end of this year in 24, but as you said, required in all contracts kind of moving forward, that journey for a large, complex customer or even a small customer who's wearing multiple hats, could be 6, 7 months or more. So I think the answer is to get started now if you haven't. You mentioned earlier about sometimes you'll get CUI and it's your data and it wasn't CUI maybe when it left the organization, but it comes back marked as CUI. And that made me think about how when you get proposals that include CUI or a case where the proposal itself maybe is considered CUI. Have you run into those scenarios? And in those scenarios, I guess I would think you have to have an infrastructure that's obviously allowed to store, process, and deal with CUI already in place.
We do, we do. So the biggest thing is the ability to restrict permissions. You obviously don't want everyone in the organization to have information, especially if they're not familiar with CUI, know what it is, know how to restrict it. So what we generally do is immediately set up a restricted folder, and really only those who need to know have access. The proposal manager or the contracts manager keeps a list of everyone who has access. We track when we download it from the government site, or when we receive it via encrypted email, where it goes, who has access to it, and if we have to do anything with it. We generally try not to email it out. There are some instances where we would have to share it with a partner. Again, you're looking at an encrypted email. The other piece of that is there are some equipment restrictions, I guess I'll say. So we're a PC company, but our graphic designer insists on using an Apple. He has a Mac, and whatever software, or again, I'm not an IT person, whatever is on his computer, he can't have access to CUI. So we have to make sure we keep him firewalled from any CUI information. So again, it's knowing that the requirements range from, the entire IT infrastructure and looking at large software packages down to one computer in the organization that could kill your compliance.
No, it's a great little kind of assembling of kind of how the sausage is made, actually, because it I think makes the point that this is a combination of people, processes, and technology. There's not, as you said earlier, just a firewall you're going to go by. Sounds like a lot of this has to do with processes that have to be documented. The employees have to be trained on it. Then they have to be audited to make sure you stay in compliance. It sounds like there's a lot of process involved as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how do you ensure the proposal team, or do you even need to, is fully aware and understands the implications of the DFARS, NIST cybersecurity requirements? Is that important?
Absolutely. We have training. Our proposal and contracts team get together at least annually, if not twice a year, talk about changes in DoD requirements, changes in the FAR, the DFAR, the NIST. We have, our processes document. We have a whole section on cyber requirements, on CUI, on markings. We have templates set up. Make sure, checklist, make sure you include this. Make sure you set up the restricted access. Make sure you use this template to document who has access and when they accessed it. So it's really part of a checklist, and it's just become part of our normal routine. When we set up a compliance matrix, one of the first things we do is look for special requirements, whether it's a top secret security facility, whether it's in special insurance, or whether it's CUI. And depending on what the requirement is, we have a process, we have a checklist that we can go to and make sure that we follow all the right instructions.
So it sounds like that compliance matrix really is probably key in terms of how you successfully navigate complex compliance requirements in a proposal. I'd love, if you can, what's that look like on the inside? Meaning you've got the compliance matrix, some of them may fall to physical security, some of them to IT, some of them to cyber. Obviously, that could all be one person at a small company, but what does the proposal team, in your experience, do? Do they reach out to that point of contact, start to have a conversation internally about these requirements, and what's that look like?
That's exactly what it looks like. So we would have a kickoff meeting, and we would bring all the stakeholders together just so they understand the big picture, what the requirement is, what the opportunity means to the organization. Hey, this is a must win. This will break us into a new market. This is a priority one, or it's not. And talk about due dates, right? Because every proposal has a due date. Norm is 30 days. If you're lucky, you might get 45 or 60, but normal is 30. So they're quick turns. And then we would reach out to each individual stakeholder and make sure they understand their requirements. We would send it in an email, you need to do 1, we need 2, we need 3, and document it with due dates and make sure they understand the requirement.
Well, so I think one of the things I'd say to the audience then, if you're sitting here, again, as an FSO, CIO, CISO, some other title, if you're not being invited to these, you've never been to a proposal kickoff meeting, there's a good chance you're always going to be playing catch up versus integrating with the business and becoming part of the process. So raise your hand and get invited to those meetings so that you can start to actually make compliance and IT and security a business conversation, not a technical conversation. So again, Erin, I think amazing insights there. How do you think about the need to be cost competitive while also meeting stringent cybersecurity requirements in your proposals or any other requirements?
Again, Eric, it's just the cost of doing business. It's like having a computer. You can't do business without having a computer. You need to make sure that computer and the infrastructure and the resources around it are compliant.
I think that's what we've certainly been saying and hearing from the DoD now for many years, is that this is a cost of doing business. And I think in hindsight, once CMMC is fully rolled out, I don't think anybody will look back and be surprised that the Department of Defense had mandatory minimum cybersecurity requirements for their contractors. It seems like it's common sense. I think a lot of Americans would probably say, I thought that was already the case. So I would agree fully that it is the cost of doing business. How do you communicate the importance and necessity of meeting cybersecurity requirements to stakeholders who may not be familiar with these aspects of the contract, or is that typically another part of the organization that would be responsible for that?
That really goes back to getting the leadership backing and the leadership buy-in. When there's a all hands meeting or a corporate meeting or communications that come out from the C-suite, they really need to foot stomp the importance of this. And the bottom line is there's going to come a time, and we all know DoD doesn't always enforce requirements when they say they're going to, but there will be a time when you will not be able to have a DoD contract. You will not even be able to bid on a DoD proposal without having met these requirements. It's just the environment we live in. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say it's just the environment we live in, and your business will not grow. Your business, you will lose contracts if you don't have that requirement met.
I think that's great to hear from somebody who's so business focused and has been in this space for a long time and isn't an IT or cybersecurity expert or professional. It's not the world you live in, but to hear that from somebody who has made their career kind of bidding and winning these contracts, I think it's a great, I think, foot stomp to the audience that this isn't going away. And what I love about this conversation is it's so business focused, not IT, multi-factor authentication, what controls you have to implement focus, because one of the challenges that I think many folks in the audience have is finding a way to get that leadership buy-in that you talk about. And I think to hear some things like go talk to the proposals team, find the compliance matrix, get your leadership buy-in and have them talking about these requirements at all hands, or really make the cybersecurity, the IT function aligned with the business so that you can make traction on these things as these requirements. And as you said, you spent 6 to 7 months figuring out how to get there and to be ready. And so this is not an overnight journey. Erin, any final thoughts? You've been super generous with your time, and I think this has been one of the best conversations of the conference, again, because it's so business focused, which at the end of the day, that's where the funding and that's where the support needs to come from in order to get compliant and win contracts. But any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with as it relates to thinking through strategies for a successful RFP process as it relates to CMMC?
I would say if you haven't started to look at those requirements, start. Start with a meeting with anyone you think could be affected, anyone you think could be involved. It could have far-reaching implications throughout the business. Every business is set up differently. Every company is structured differently. Everyone has different processes. It really is far-reaching. I almost equate it to, as I'm thinking through it, it's like having internet, right? So you wouldn't have a company now and not have internet. That's just, you wouldn't even fathom that. I honestly feel that's what we're trending towards. DoD sometimes go through phases and fads and trends, and there's buzzwords. This one's not going away. We've been looking at this for 12 to 18 months. They're implementing more cyber requirements. I think it's gonna get more attention rather than less in the future. So if you haven't started, start.
I think that's a wonderful call to action, Erin, for everyone in our audience. And it takes into account the fact that every company does do business differently, but this is a requirement that every company doing business with today, the DoD, and I think soon the entire federal government is going to have to deal with. So great way to end it with the call to action. And Erin, thank you so much for your time today. I think this has been a wonderful session for our audience.
Thank you, Eric. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Erin, for that informative question and answer session discussing how to align proposals with DoD requirements to ensure compliance.